So we're a duo here today. I'm Mike Ulrey. This is Jeff Musiak. We both work on the same project. Jeff has joined me most recently and now is pretty much the main guy. I just sort of watch him do the work, but I'm going to do the talking, most of the talking today. We're from Boeing. We're in the air traffic management group. Some of you possibly know I gave a talk on a similar topic 4 years ago, and this is kind of an update, showing you some results we've gotten on work we've done on contracts and various other activities. Air traffic management, what is it? Why does Boeing care about air traffic management? They just build the airplanes, right? Well, we're a small organization, not a big organization within Boeing, but it's very important to do air traffic management or to be concerned with it. We do mostly research in it. We don't build things like Lockheed Martin or Raytheon, which builds equipment for air traffic controllers and so forth. We're mostly interested in working with standards bodies, with airlines, with regulators, with air service providers, with government agencies like NASA or MITRE, with international standards bodies like ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization, national standards bodies like RTCA. We're interested in those things because we want to keep airplanes flying, obviously, because we build them. And a lot of these activities, we cooperate with our competitors, Airbus, for example, because it's good for business for both of us. But anyway, today we're going to show you a little bit about some of the tools we developed in Mathematica to do safety analysis for certain operations. So moving along here. So we model and simulate new operational procedures, and we mostly address safety and feasibility issues. Are these new procedures safe and are they feasible? Next, we look at approaches to closely spaced parallel runways, and here's a little picture of San Francisco as an example of closely spaced parallel runway. Next, we look at what are called required navigation performance procedures. Now, required navigation performance is a standard, but it's also a technology. It depends who's talking about it. But you have technologies which go into making an airplane capable of meeting the required navigation performance. Mostly, it applies to the lateral performance of the aircraft, but it can be applied in all phases of flight. And there's movements to make it apply to all the dimensions of the aircraft motion, but right now it's mostly lateral, and the technologies control that variability. Next point. And today, what we do, ILS procedures, what we're comparing to today, are standard ILS procedures, which are ground-based technologies, an antenna on the ground near the airport, near the runway, that guides you side to side, laterally, and vertically, glide slope and localizer. And required navigation performance puts more of the responsibility on the aircraft itself using satellite navigation. So, what's the motivation for all this? The FAA is very interested in it. First bullet. They have a thing called the Next Gen Initiative, multi-billion-dollar, multi-year project to improve the air traffic management in the U.S., mostly at the largest 35 airports and mostly for air transport category aircraft, although of course they have to consider general aviation as well. And then a lot of the initiatives are green issues, reducing fuel burn, reducing track time, reducing emissions, reducing the noise footprint. And what we're interested in showing you today is research we've been doing related to safety analysis. Now, R&P procedures compared to current procedures. Here's a picture of tracks, actual radar tracks at Kelowna in BC, and the magenta lines are the standard approaches, the current procedures where controllers vector the aircraft from the downwind onto the approach into the airport. And once they acquire the ILS, you can see it gets straight, but they have to acquire way out here. So it's a long, long path. Now you notice the yellow line there, that looks like a single line. It's not. It's multiple approaches, just like the purple lines. But those are the R&P approaches. And you notice it's much closer in. It's more accurate, it's more predictable. And it saves fuel, it saves time, it saves emissions. So that's why we're interested in this. But this turn-in close to the runway and giving the responsibility to the aircraft to do that based on its own navigation, based on GPS and its flight management computer, is a safety issue. You know, any new technology, any new procedure obviously has to go through a lot of scrutiny. So that's why we're looking at this sort of thing. Actually, this kind of procedure is, if you go to the next slide, this kind of procedure is well accepted in the world for single approaches. As a matter of fact, Alaska Airlines pioneered this in Alaska in approaches to Juneau. Now, this is not a picture of that, but in the Gastineau Channel, going many miles through, flying between mountains in the fog, in the clouds. They do it all the time. And, but what we want to do is extend this, next slide, what we want to do is extend this to traffic. Airplanes not flying against mountains, but airplanes flying against other airplanes. That's what we're all about right now. That's what we're going to talk about today. So that's the first point. The second point is that ILS approaches, I've said this before, I'll say it again, and the approaches, this is a Mathematica picture of some of the approaches we look at. They're very long. They have to start way out straight, come in straight. And in contrast, what we're looking at are R&P approaches with a so-called radius to fixed turn. And that just means there's a center defined, there's a radius defined, and you turn in very close to the runway. You save time, you save fuel, and emissions, and all that good stuff. But you'll notice in that picture that the airplanes are kind of pointed at each other. That makes people nervous, real nervous. So you want to know, how can I do that safely? Well, the next picture will show you a little bit about some of the issues. One of the issues that we're going to talk about today is the so-called Tcas nuisance alert problem. Tcas stands for Traffic Collision Avoidance System, and aircraft of a certain size with a certain number of passengers have to have it. And aircraft that have it communicate with each other, talk to each other, and they say, you're getting too close, now you're really getting too close, now you got to do something, get out of there. And so you have to design the procedures so that you don't get those alerts. Of course, you want them if you're really going to crash for some reason, you want to have them. But you don't want them arising just because your geometry was stupid or your speeds were stupid or something like that. So you have to design the procedures so that the aircraft don't quite come together to cause the nuisance alert or cause the alert to go off. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We've done a lot of safety analysis on a lot of different things, but we don't have all day, so we're going to just focus on this one topic. So how does the collision avoidance system work? It's called Tcas. It's pronounced Tcas when you talk the jargon. It stands for Traffic Collision Avoidance System. There's basically two kinds of alerts. There's a traffic advisory and there's a resolution advisory. And in the cartoon here, you see this is our aircraft. You're in this one here. You're flying in this one. So you're concerned when you see an aircraft coming right towards you here, or not necessarily even right towards you, but on a collision course. And then there's kind of a protective shells around you. The first one is the TA region, where it says, hey, there's traffic out there. Look out for it. Don't do anything yet, but it's there. So this is kind of a notice. If you get to the RA region, that's bad. You're about to crash, do something. And it's usually a cooperative maneuver where one aircraft climbs and one descends. The reason they don't do this is because the bearing information from Tcas is very bad. So you don't know exactly where that guy is in angle, in azimuth, but it's very accurate in altitude, so you climb and descend. Or one may climb and the other keeps going, but it depends on the situation. In altitude, you have very simple criteria, just 600 feet for a resolution, 800 feet for traffic advisory. Now we have a little animation to show you. Let's see if this works. We're going to do the MP4. Now the sound is going to be out of sync because we have to start this separately to make it bigger and go faster. So you see two aircraft coming toward. This, by the way, is the pilot display. This is the airplane you're in. Right here, it stays steady. This is the intruder coming down. Oh, we got the traffic. We lost the sound. Anyway, you got the TA already. Now you got the RA. Oh, there it is. There's the sound. So now this guy's climbing. The other guy's not descending. I don't know why in this particular situation. But anyway, he doesn't listen or something. And then once he's passed, he descends. And so here's our airplane. This guy's behind us, so we don't care about him anymore. So now we can go back down to our flight level. Okay? So that's how a Tcas encounter is supposed to work. Okay.
Is that part of the autopilot, or is that a manual procedure?
No, the pilot has to do that. The pilot is, it's not wired into the autopilot. The pilot is supposed to respond. And it's supposed to be ignore controller instructions at that point in time, which has been a problem in the past. For those of you who know about the Uberlingen accident between the Russian airliner and the DHL freighter several years ago. Anyway, okay, next slide. So, yeah, already, good. I'm going to skip those two. No, that's okay. The criteria, so there's two criteria for alert. There's a range alert, a range rate, a collision is imminent, and altitude rate, basically, time to come together in altitude. Those two have to be satisfied simultaneously for an alert to be generated. And finally, details. The details of that. And by the way, this is even a way oversimplification of the whole algorithm. If you look at the algorithm, it's pages and pages and pages, all kinds of exceptions. And well, if this guy doesn't follow it, and you can see these videos on YouTube where there's just like going this, like a dance. You go through the door. I'm going right. You're going left. Oh no, you go that way. I'll go. No, let's dance. That sort of thing. That's not in here. It's supposed to work simply. But anyway, it's based on altitude. You have different warning times based on how high you are. These are the TAs and the RAs. You notice the RA is always less than the TA in seconds. These are distance thresholds. That's if you're flying very close together, but you're not closing. You're just kind of flying side by side. You have to be a certain distance apart because you don't know if one guy suddenly goes like this. You want them to be fairly far away from you. And finally, the altitude threshold just has to do with, it's actually more complicated than this, but for all practical purposes, 600 feet, you get an RA, 850 feet, you get a TA, assuming the range rate's close enough too. Okay. Now some examples. These are pictures from Mathematica. This is a simulation of the approaches. This is one aircraft coming, the green on one approach, the blue aircraft on the other approach. Notice they're separated by enough, i.e. in this case 1.5 nautical miles, which is this dotted line here. This lower dotted line is 1.5 nautical miles. Now this particular approach, they're supposed to stay at least 1.5 nautical miles apart. Usually more, but at least. As long as they obey that, they won't normally on this approach hit any of these thresholds. These are the constant time thresholds. This is range here, this is rate here. Range divided by rate is time. So these are constant time curves here. So if you don't go below those curves, you can't cause an alert. Okay, the next one. Let's look at one where they are generated. In this case, they obviously got too close together. As a matter of fact, they're side by side. So when they came right here, they started generating alerts, or at least potentially, as you can see, going below the threshold. Now, if the altitude threshold had been met at that altitude where the thresholds are defined, they would have gotten an alert. This doesn't necessarily get one. It just means that you have the potential for one if all the other criteria are satisfied at the same time. Okay, next one. That was for TAs. This is the same deal for RAs. The only difference is that these constant timelines are lower slope. It's the only difference. Everything else is the same. So obviously you don't get an alert there. And finally, if you're nose to nose, you're going to get a potential for some alerts here. Okay? All right. So now we can go to the real interactive demo. So let's pick a few bookmarks. Buffer lead, but that means I'm giving this aircraft a really big buffer, even more than 1.5 nautical miles, so you're well above all the alerts. Now let's look at some of the buttons. Let's go RA and TA, switch RA and TA. You can see the lines go up and down, just switch back and forth a few times. You see the difference, the TA is higher, the RAs are lower, so you're going to hit a TA before you hit an RA. The R&P levels are basically the noise in the airplane tracking. When we turn up the R&P level, it means it's allowed to have more error in its flight path. When we turn down the R&P level, basically that means there's less error in the flight path. So vary that a little bit. See how it gets jerkier when you turn up the R&P level? Now in our simulation, of course, we don't just have two. We have any R&P level you want. And we have all kinds of variability vertically, laterally, longitudinally. But we're just demonstrating one of the parameters we can vary here. Now, let's try a little, let's go to the last one, separation violate. So this is a bad case where they got really close to each other, less than 1.5 nautical miles apart. So they're going to have some potential violations. So let's go back to one of the normal ones. Let's go normal lead, and then let's just run. Let's just play it on simulation time. Now you'll see a red dot come down the line. That red dot corresponds to the position of the aircraft over there. So you can see their history of the collision time. Time to collision is a red curve. You can see what that is based on that trajectory. This happens to be a trajectory where they never go below 1.5 nautical miles, so they're good. They're doing what they're supposed to do, so they don't have a potential alert. Okay? Now let's try it with the offset. What's the offset? The offset has to do with how soon the green aircraft starts after the blue aircraft starts. In other words, it's how the controllers, how ATC sets up the approach so that one's ahead of the other, and he's got to plan it in his head, so that they don't go below 1.5 nautical miles. And this has, in the face of winds and all kinds of other things. The nice thing about R&P is the controller is set and forget. Once he sets it, he's monitoring, of course, but the aircraft is expected to be on rails after that point. In other words, it's what we call R&P established. They don't have to worry about them anymore, just like an ILS approach today. Once they get that beam, that radio beam that guides them to the ground, the controller basically says, I'm forgetting about you. I mean, of course they watch him, but they basically don't have to worry about him anymore because he's got guidance. Same way here with R&P. Now what you'll see is this curve goes up and down as you see the changing in the starting point, right? How they're starting relative to each other. And sometimes they can get below the 1.5 nautical miles and get into the danger zone where they might get a traffic alert, okay? Okay, now we can stop this and go to the next one. So this is great for intuition and visualization, and by the way, this is how we got a lot of our ideas about what kind of analysis to do. So what do you have to do to make it be useful to the FAA or any other regulator? You have to do some Monte Carlo simulations. So we take this basic model and we run thousands and thousands. Well, it depends on which kind of safety analysis we're doing, but in some cases, tens of thousands of approaches and various things, like the longitudinal, vertical, lateral variability. Then we also vary systematic parameters like track geometry, the speeds, the altitude profiles, the wind effects, and the runway spacings, because different airports have different runway spacings. And then as outputs, we look at several criteria. One is estimates of near-mid collisions, mid-air collisions, the frequency of those. The regulators are very interested in keeping those down. And as a flying passenger, I'm sure you are too. Estimates of the frequency of wake encounters, where one aircraft gets behind the other and gets in the wake vortex, and there's a control upset because the rotating vortex can make the following aircraft go into a roll, unintended roll. And finally, estimates of safety margin to the nuisance Tcas alerts, which is what we discussed here in this particular talk today. But we also do the other things as well. So now I'm going to show you a couple of examples of some output. This is not very interesting because nothing happened. This is because the aircraft were properly spaced. See, the blue aircraft is well behind the green aircraft. And if there had been alerts, they would show up on this plot over here, but nothing showed up over here. So we're good to go for that particular configuration. The next one, however, we had them side by side. Somebody didn't do their job. And now we're getting alerts. The blue are the TAs, the red are the RAs. Of course, the RAs are what people are really worried about, because that means somebody's got to do something that's bad. Because when an airplane has to suddenly do an evasive maneuver, he might hit somebody else, unintentionally. So nobody likes that to happen. So you want to avoid the red at all costs. And you can see, and this is where the Monte Carlo simulation comes in, because this plot is over multiple runs, an aggregate of all those runs with all the noise on the aircraft trajectories. So the red dots don't necessarily all come from the same approach. They come from thousands of approaches. So you can see that this is not good. But this is what we try to stay away from. Okay, we're almost there. This is the same data set, just a different plot. We get some requests to have it produced in a slightly different format. This shows it against time instead of on the actual geometric trajectory. This is against time. This is simulation time on the x-axis, and this is distance from the runway threshold on the y-axis. And this is in nautical miles. And you can see, again, you get some RAs, which is bad, in this particular region of the simulation. And that's what you want to stay away from. This gives you a little bit better idea because of what's going on, because these vertical lines are waypoints of interest. Pilots and controllers think in terms of waypoints. Where would this happen? What waypoint would you be near when this happened? This helps you see it a little bit better.